Hi, good morning. This is story time with Honey, Saratella, and I am going to read one chapter of Harriet the Spy, which was Uncle Craig and your dad's, Max and Millie, your dad's favorite book when he was about in the 5th grade, I think. He loved it. It's called Harriet the Spy by Louise Fitzhugh. You ready? There aren't too many pictures. That says book 1. And that's Harriet. Well, first let me tell you a couple things. It takes place in Manhattan, which is one of the islands in New York City. And they talk about a filling station a lot. I don't know if you know what a filling station is, but that's what we used to call gas stations. So when they say filling station, just think gas station. And there might be some other words, but we'll figure them out as we go along. Chapter 1. Harriet was trying to explain to Sport, that's her friend, Sport, how to play town. See, first you make up the name of the town, then you write down the names of all the people who live in it. You can't have too many people or it gets too hard. I usually have 25. That's Harriet talking. Sport was tossing around a football in the air. They were in the courtyard of Harriet's house on East 87th Street in Manhattan. Then, when you know who lives there, you make up what they do. For instance, Mr. Charles Hanley runs the filling station on the corner. Harriet spoke thoughtfully as she squatted next to the big tree, bending so low over her notebook that her long, straight hair touched the edges. "Don't you want to play football?" Sport asked. "Now listen, Sport. You never did this, and it's fun. Now over here next to the curve in the mountain, we'll put the filling station. So if anything happens there, you remember where it is." Sport tucked the football under his arm and walked over to her. "That's nothing but an old tree root. What do you mean a mountain?" "That's a mountain. From now on, that's a mountain. Got it?" Harriet looked up at his face. Sport moved back a pace. "Looks like an old tree root," he muttered. Harriet pushed her hair back and looked at him seriously. "Sport, what are you going to be when you grow up?" "You know what? I'm going to be a ball player." "Well, I'm going to be a writer. And when I say that's a mountain, that's a mountain." Satisfied, she turned back to her town. Sport put the football gently on the ground and knelt beside her, looking over her shoulder at the notebook in which she scribbled furiously. "Now, as soon as we've got all the men's names down and all the wives' names and their children's names, then you figure out all their professions. You've got to have a doctor, a lawyer, and an Indian chief." Sport interrupted. "No, someone who works in television." "What makes you think they have television?" "I say they do. And anyway, my father has to be in it, doesn't he?" "Well, then put mine in it too. Put a writer in it." "Okay, we can make Mr. Jonathan Fishbone a writer. And let him have a son like me who cooks for him." Sport rocked back and forth on his heels, chanting and sing-song. "And let him be 11 years old like me, and let him have a mother who went away and has all the money, and let him grow up to be a ball player." "No," said Harriet in disgust. "Then you're not making it up. Don't you understand?" Sport paused. "No," he said. "Just listen, Sport. See, now that we have all this written down, I'll show you where the fun is." Harriet got very businesslike. She stood up, then she got on her knees in the soft September mud so she could lean over the little valley made between the two big roots of the tree. She referred to her notebook every now and then, but for the most part she stared intently at the mossy lowlands which made her town. Now one night, late at night, Mr. Charles Hanley is in his filling station. He's just about to turn out the lights and go home because it's 9 o'clock and time for him to get ready for bed. But he's a grown-up. Sport looked intently at the spot occupied by the gas station. "In this town, everybody goes to bed at 9:30, Harriet said. "Oh." Sport rocked a little back on his heels. "My father goes to bed at 9 in the morning. Sometimes I meet him getting up. And also, Dr. Jones is delivering a baby to Mrs. Harrison right over here in the hospital." "Here is the hospital. "The Carterville General Hospital," and she pointed to the other side of the town. Sport looked at the left route. "What is Mr. Fishpond, the writer, doing?" Harriet pointed to the center of town. "He's in the town bar, which is right here." Harriet looked down at the town as though hypnotized. "Here's what happens. See, now this night, as Mr. Hanley is just about to close up, a long, big, old black car drives up, and in it there are all these men with guns. They drive in real fast, and Mr. Hanley gets scared. They jump out of the car and run over and rob Mr. Hanley, who is petrified. They steal all the money in the gas station. Then they fill up their gas free, and then they zoom off into the night. Mr. Hanley's all bound and gagged on the floor." Sport's mouth hung open. Then what? At this very same minute, Mrs. Harrison's baby is born, and Dr. Jones says, "You have a fine baby girl, Mrs. Harrison, a fine baby girl, ho, ho, ho." "Make it a boy." "No, it's a girl. She already has a boy." "What does the baby look like?" "She's ugly." Now, also at this very minute, on the other side of town, over here past the gas station, almost to the mountain, the robbers have stopped at a farmhouse which belongs to old Farmer Dodge. They go in and find him eating oatmeal because he doesn't have any teeth. They throw the oatmeal on the floor and demand some other food. He doesn't have anything but oatmeal, so they beat him up. Then they settle down to spend the night. Now, at this very minute, the police chief of Carterville, who's called Chief Herbert, takes a stroll down the main street. He senses something's not right, and he wonders what it is. "Harriet, get up out of that mud!" a harsh voice rang out from the third floor of the brownstone behind them. Harriet looked up. There was a hint of anxiety in her face. Oh, golly, I'm not in the mud." The face of the nurse looking out the window was not the best-looking face in the world, but for all its frowning, its sharp, dark lines, there was kindness there. "Harriet M. Welch, you are to rise to your feet." Harriet rose without hesitation. "But listen, we'll have to play town standing up." "That's the best way," came back sharply, and the head disappeared. Sport stood up too. "Why don't we play football then?" "No, look, if I just sit like this, I won't be in the mud." So saying, she squatted on her heels next to the town. Now he senses that something is wrong. How can he? He hasn't seen anything, and it's all on the other side of town. He just feels it. He's a very good police chief. "Well," Sport said dubiously. "No, since he's the only policeman in town, he goes around and deputizes everyone and says to them, 'Something's fishy in this town. I feel it in my bones.' And everybody follows him, and they get on their horses." "Horses!" Sport shrieked. "They get in their squad car, and they drive around town until—" "Harriet!" The back door slammed, and old Golly marched squarely toward them across the yard. Her long black shoes made a slap, slap noise on the brick. "Hey, where you going?" asked Harriet, jumping up, because old Golly had on her outdoor things. Old Golly just had indoor things and outdoor things. She never wore anything as recognizable as a skirt, a jacket, or a sweater. She just had yards and yards of tweed, which enveloped her like a lot of discarded blankets, which ballooned out when she walked, and which she referred to as her things. "I'm going to take you somewhere. It's time you began to see the world. You're 11 years old, and it's time you saw something." She stood there above them so tall that when they looked up, they saw the blue sky behind her head. Harriet felt a twinge of guilt because she had seen a lot more than old Golly thought she had. But all she said was, "Oh, boy," and jumped up and down. "Get your coat and hurry. We're leaving right now." Old Golly always did everything right now. "Come on, Sport. It won't hurt you to look around, too." "I have to be back at 7 to cook dinner," Sport said. "We'll be back long before that. Harriet and I eat at 6. Why do you eat so late?" "He has cocktails first. I have olives and peanuts." "That's nice. Now go get your coats." Sport and Harriet ran through the back door, slamming it behind them. "What's all that noise?" spluttered the cook, who whirled around just in time to see them fly through the kitchen door and up the back steps. Harriet's room was at the top of the house, so they had 3 flights to run up, and they were breathless by the time they got there. "Where are we going?" Sport shouted after Harriet's flying feet. "I don't know," Harriet panted as they entered her room, but old Golly always has good places. Sport grabbed his coat and was out the door and halfway down the stairs when Harriet asked, Wait, I can't find my notebook." "Oh, what do you need that for?" Sport yelled. "I never go anywhere without it," came the muffled answer. "Aw, come on, Harriet." There were great crashing noises coming from the bedroom. "Harriet, did you fall down?" A muffled but very relieved voice came out. "I found it. It must have slipped behind the bed." And Harriet emerged, clutching a green composition book. "You must have 100 of them by now," Sport said as he went down the steps. "Nope, I have 14. This is number 15. "How would I have 100? I've only been working since I was 8, and I'm only 11 now. I wouldn't even have this many, except at first I wrote so big my regular route took almost the whole book." "Do you see the same people every day?" "Yes. This year I have the DeSanti family, little Joe Curry, the Robinsons, Harrison Withers, and a new one, Mrs. Plummer. Mrs. Plummer's the hardest because I have to get into the dumbwaiter. Now I'm going to stop a second. A dumbwaiter is like an elevator in the wall. And people a long time ago used to put their dishes or laundry in it and send it up and down so they didn't have to walk the stairs. That's a dumbwaiter. "Can I go with you sometimes?" That's Sport talking. "No, silly. Spies don't go with friends. Anyway, we'd get caught if there were 2 of us. Why don't you get your own route?" "Sometimes I watch out my window, a window across the way." "What happens there?" "Nothing. A man comes home, pulls down the window shade." "Well, that's not exciting." "It sure isn't." They met old Golly waiting for them, tapping her foot outside the front door. They walked to 86th Street, took the crosstown bus, and soon they were whizzing along in the subway, sitting in a line. Old Golly, then Harriet, then Sport. Old Golly stared straight ahead, and Harriet was scribbling furiously in her notebook. "What are you writing?" Sport asked. "I'm taking notes on all those people who are sitting over there." "Why?" "Ah, Sport," Harriet was exasperated. "Because I've seen them and I want to remember them." She turned back to her book and continued her notes. Man with rolled white socks, fat legs. Woman with one cross eye and a long nose. Horrible-looking little boy and a fat blonde mother who keeps wiping his nose off. Funny lady looks like a teacher and is reading. I don't think I'd like to live where any of these people live, or do the things they do. I bet that little boy is sad and cries a lot. I bet that lady with the cross eye looks in the mirror and just feels terrible." Old Golly leaned over and spoke to them. "We're going to Far Rockaway. It's about 3 stops from here. I want you to see how this person lives, Harriet. This is my family." Harriet almost gasped. She looked up at old Golly in astonishment. I'm seeing how far this chapter goes. Not too far. But old Golly just stared out the window again. Harriet continued to write in her notebook. "This is incredible. Good old Golly have a family? I never thought about it. How could old Golly have a mother and father? She's too old for one thing, and she's never said one word about them, and I've known her since I was born. Also, she doesn't get any letters. Think about this. This might be important." They came to their stop, and old Golly led them off the subway. "Gee," said Sport as they came up to the sidewalk, "we're near the ocean." They could smell it, the salt and even a wild, soft spray which blew gently across their faces, then was gone. "Yes," said old Golly briskly. Harriet could see the change in her. She walked faster and held her head higher. They were walking down a street that led to the water. The houses, set back from the sidewalk with a patch of green in front, were built of yellow brick, interspersed with red. It wasn't very pretty, Harriet thought, but maybe they liked their houses this way, better than those plain old red brick ones in New York. Old Golly was walking faster and looking sterner. She looked as though she wished she hadn't come. Abruptly, she turned in a sidewalk leading to a house. She strode relentlessly up the stairs, never looking back, never saying a word. Sport and Harriet followed, wide-eyed up the steps to the front door, through the front hall, and out the back door. She's lost her mind, Harriet thought. She and Sport looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Like that. Then they saw old Golly was headed for a small private house, which sat in its own garden behind the apartment house. Harriet and Sport stood still, not knowing what to do. This little house was like a house in the country, the kind Harriet saw when she went to Watermill in the summer. The unpainted front had the same soft gray of driftwood, the roof a darker gray. "Come on, chickens, let's get us a hot cup of tea," old Golly, suddenly gay, waved from the funny little rotting porch. Harriet and Sport ran toward the house, but stopped cold when the front door opened with a loud swish. There, suddenly, was the largest woman Harriet had ever seen. "Why, look-a here what's coming," she bellowed. "Look at them little rascals." And her great fat face crinkled into large tearful lumps as her mouth split to show a toothless grin. She had no teeth. She let forth a high, burbling laugh. Sport and Harriet stood staring, their mouths open. The fat lady stood like a mountain, her hands on her hips, in a flowered cotton print dress and an enormous hanging coat sweater. Probably the biggest sweater in the world, Harriet thought. Probably the biggest pair of shoes, too. And her shoes were a wonder. Long, black, bumpy things with high lace sides up the middle of the shin, bulging with the effort of holding in those ankles, and their laces splitting them into grins against the whites of the socks below. Harriet fairly itched to take notes on her. "Where'd you get these little things?" Her cheer rang out all over the neighborhood. "This the little Welsh lady baby? That her brother?" Sport just giggled. "No, this is my husband," Harriet shouted. Old Golly turned a grim face. "Don't be snarky, Harriet, and don't think you're so funny either." The fat lady laughed, making her face fall into lumps again. She looked like dough, Harriet thought, about to be made into a big round Italian loaf. She wanted to tell Sport this, but old Golly was leading them in, all of them squeezing past that mountain of a stomach, because the fat lady stood, rather stupidly, in the doorway. Old Golly marched to the tea kettle and put a fire under it. Then she turned in a businesslike way and introduced them. "Children, this is my mother, Mrs. Golly. Mother, you can close the door now. Mother, this is Harriet Welch." "Harriet M. Welch," Harriet corrected. "You know perfectly well you have no middle name, but if you insist, Harriet M. Welch. And this is Sport. What's your last name, Sport?" "Rock. Simon Rock." He pronounced it Rock. Simon. Hee 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 hee. Harriet felt very ugly all of a sudden. "You're not to make fun of anyone's name." Old Golly loomed over Harriet, and it was one of those times when Harriet knew she meant it. "I take it back," Harriet said quickly. "That's better," old Golly turned away cheerfully. "Now let's all sit down and have some tea." Well, ain't she a cute little thing? Harriet could see that Mrs. Golly was still hung up on the introductions. She stood like a mountain, her big ham hands dangling helplessly at her sides. "Sit down, Mother," old Golly said gently, and Mrs. Golly sat. Harriet and Sport looked at each other. The same thought was occurring to both of them. This fat lady was not very bright. Mrs. Golly sat to the left of Harriet. She leaned over Harriet. In fact, she looked directly into her eyes. Harriet felt like she was something in a zoo. "Now, Harriet, look around you," old Golly said sternly as she poured the tea. "I brought you here because you've never seen the inside of a house like this. Have you ever seen a house that has one bed, one table, 4 chairs, and a bathtub in the kitchen?" Harriet had to move her chair back to see around Mrs. Golly, who leaned toward her motionless, still looking. The room was a strange one. There was a sad little rug next to the stove. Harrison Withers has only a bed and a table, Harriet thought to himself. But since she didn't want old Golly to know she had been peering through Harrison Withers' skylight, she didn't say anything. Here's a picture of Old Golly's mother, Mrs. Golly. See, there's not many pictures. That's the first one. That's Mrs. Golly. I didn't think you had, said Old Golly. Look around and drink your tea, children. You may have some more milk and sugar if I haven't put in enough. I don't drink tea, said Sport. Old Golly shot an eye at him. What do you mean you don't drink tea? I mean, I never have. You mean you've never tasted it? No, said Sport, and he looked a little terrified. Harriet looked at Old Golly. Old Golly wore an arch expression which signified that she was about to quote. There are few hours in life more agreeable than the hour dedicated to the ceremony known as afternoon tea. Old Golly said this steadily and sedately. Then she leaned back in her chair with a satisfied look at Sport. Sport looked completely blank. Henry James, said Old Golly, 1843 to 1916, from Portrait of a Lady. Henry James was an author, and that's when he lived a long time ago. What's that? Sport asked Harriet. A novel, silly. Oh, like my father writes, said Sport, and dismissed the whole thing. My daughter's a smart one, mumbled Mrs. Golly, still looking straight at Harriet. Behold, Harriet, a woman who had never had any interest in anyone else, nor in any book, nor in any school, nor in any way of life, but has lived her whole life in this room, eating and sleeping and waiting to die. Harriet looked at Mrs. Golly in horror. Said, should Old Golly be saying those things? Wouldn't Mrs. Golly get mad? But Mrs. Golly just sat looking contentedly at Harriet. Perhaps, thought Harriet, she forgets to turn her head away from something unless she's told. Try it, Sport, it's good. Harriet spoke to Sport quickly in an effort to change the subject. Sport took a sip. It's not bad, he said weakly. Try everything, Sport, at least once, Old Golly said, as though her mind wasn't really on it. Harriet looked around at her curiously. Old Golly was acting very strange indeed. She seemed... Was she angry? No, not angry. She seemed sad. Harriet realized with a start that it was the first time she had ever seen Old Golly look sad. She hadn't even known Old Golly could be sad. Almost as though she were thinking the same thing, Old Golly suddenly shook her head and sat up straight. Well, I think we've had enough tea and enough sights for a day. I think we better go back home now. The most extraordinary thing happened next. Mrs. Golly leaped to her fat feet and threw her teacup down on the floor. You're always leaving, she screamed. Now, Mother, Old Golly said calmly. Mrs. Golly hopped around the middle of the floor like a giant doll. She made Harriet think of those balloons blown up like people that bounced around on the end of a string. Sport giggled suddenly. Harriet felt like giggling, but she wasn't sure she should. Mrs. Golly bobbed away. Just come here to leave me again. Always leaving. Thought you'd come for good this time. Now, Mother, Old Golly said, but this time got to her feet, walked to her mother, and laid a firm hand on her bouncing shoulder. Mother, she said gently, you know I'll be here next week. Oh, that's right, said Mrs. Golly. She stopped jumping immediately and gave a big smile to Harriet and Sport. Oh, boy, said Sport under his breath. Harriet sat fascinated. Then Old Golly got them all bundled into their clothes, and they were outside on the street again, having waved to a cheerful Mrs. Golly. They walked along through the darkening day. Boy, oh boy, was all Sport could say. Harriet couldn't wait to get back to her room to finish her notes. Old Golly looked steadily ahead. There was no expression in her face at all. And that's the end of Chapter 1. That was about 24 minutes long, and I hope you liked it, because Uncle Craig and your dad loved it. So, we'll have Chapter 2 tomorrow. I hope you liked it. I see ya, and I love ya.